Hello, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 2 of the Virtual Coffee Podcast. I'm Becca, and this is a podcast that features members of the Virtual Coffee community. Virtual Coffee is an intimate group of developers at all stages of their coding journey, and they're here on this podcast sharing their stories and what they've learned. And we're here to share it with you. Here with me today is my co-host, Dan.
Thanks, Becca. Today we're joined by Todd Libby. Todd is a web developer, designer, and accessibility advocate, and he's been doing it for over 20 years. He's currently an accessibility engineer at Webstaurant Store, and he's also a member of the World Wide Web Consortium, also known as the W3C, doing work updating their web content accessibility guidelines. Todd also hosts a podcast called Front End Nerdery, so once you're done listening to this episode, head over there and give that one a listen. We had a great time talking with Todd and hearing about his long journey in tech, how and why he developed a career focusing on accessibility, and shared with us about what accessibility means to him and what kinds of things all developers can do to ensure their work is accessible by everyone. I know you're going to enjoy it.
We start every episode of the podcast like we start every virtual coffee. We introduce ourselves with our name, where we're from, what we do, and a random check-in question. Today's question is, what famous artist, dead or alive, would you want to paint your portrait? We hope you enjoy this episode. My name is Becca. I am a front-end developer from a small town in Ohio, and if I could have one person paint my portrait, when I was in college, Georgia, there was like big Georgia O'Keeffe paintings or replicas in the hallways of my department, and I always loved them. And I know that's not what she doesn't paint people, but I think it would be cool to see how I would be represented by her. So I'm gonna go with Georgia O'Keeffe.
Hi, I'm Dan. I'm a front-end developer in Cleveland, Ohio, and does it have to be famous person?
Did I say famous?
It said famous in the question.
No, like just take it out. Just
Kate, one of my good friends, Kate Bordeaux from college. I would say that would be the person. If that'd be famous. I don't really know a lot of famous painter names. I mean, except for like the really famous ones, and that seems like a boring answer. Maybe have Raphael, but not the artist, the Ninja Turtle.
Or my son.
Yeah. well, sure. There's that too. Yeah. Any Raphael, really. I'll take any version.
Sounds like a good choice.
And I'm Todd Libby. I am a front-end developer and accessibility engineer currently in Phoenix, Arizona. And I guess my artist would be, I don't know, he was really unique, so I guess I would say Salvador Dali.
That's cool.
That'd be a good one.
There's anytime somebody is from Phoenix, I think of a short story that I read from Sherman Alexie. This is what it means to say Phoenix, Arizona. And I remember nothing about the short story except for the title. And it's just automatically, that's what comes into my mind. So if you haven't read it, check it out and then remind me what it was about.
I haven't, but I will look that up, definitely. I'm originally from Portland, Maine, so of course everybody knows me because of the lobster roll thing. So
yes, Todd is all about the lobsters, and in our virtual coffee Slack, he always uses the lobster emoji to respond to people, and so we just automatically recognize that it's Todd. So it's like he has claimed that emoji, and it's one of the greatest things ever.
Yeah, it's really cool, and it's just like you see the lobster emoji pop up, you're like, oh, cool, Todd's here. Excellent.
I always think it's funny, like when new people come into virtual coffee and then they also click the lobster emoji.
I mean, I always click it. I mean, I don't do it first, you know what I mean? But like, it's like high fiving Todd, It's like, yeah, it's celebrating the Toddness of it.
Yeah,
virtual high five.
That's right.
Right, and it can be about all sorts of different things. Like somebody could post a question that they have, and then like there's a lobster emoji. It's not about lobster, although if I had a question about lobster, I would definitely ask Todd first.
I've got a million and one answers.
I feel like that's a separate podcast episode.
It is.
Thank you so much for being here with us, Todd.
Thank you.
We always like to start with the origin story. How did you get to where you are today? So if you want to take us through that path, that would be awesome.
Yeah. Oh boy, that's a long one. I'll give you the abridged version. 9 years old, I started on a Commodore PET in school, and then gradually worked my way up to a Commodore 64, where I learned BASIC, a lot of different flavors of BASIC, and was just, it was just a hobby, of course, at that point. But what was it, about 1999? I had a 386 desktop IBM computer, and I started to learn HTML, and this was before CSS, so that is an indication of how old I am. And JavaScript was just kicking around. I started learning how to design websites using Front Page Express in Internet Explorer 3 and 4. And just it went from there. Programming was cool. I used to do in BASIC on a Commodore. I would program, if anybody remembers those Choose Your Own Adventure books from way back in the day.
Oh yeah.
I used to program a text-based, pretty much copied, and I hope no one's listening from that company, but I used to just practice. I would just, code those books into a text-based game on Commodore 64. And that's really what got me started, because I was living in a very rural area in New England, and there wasn't much to do, so except for programming at that point. So skip ahead to today, or when I started professionally, that was 22 years ago. And I started, I read Jeffrey Zeldman's book, Designing with Web Standards, instantly got hooked into web standards, progressive enhancement, accessibility, and it just, took off to the point where it is today, where I'm in the field that I enjoy being in, and that's accessibility.
I think that's awesome. I love that book too. And Jeffrey Zeldman. I've been so 22 years ago is what, 99, 2000, something like that.
Yeah.
And I think I got into, I was starting to make something around then, and really kind of got a lot more into it a couple years later. But was with the web standards, movement and everything like that. And I've been, similarly front end focused for a long time. And one of the reasons I was very excited to have you on this podcast, and just to kind of get to hang out a little bit more.
Yeah.
It's so, focusing on front end and focusing on accessibility, things like that. What career opportunities has that presented you from, starting? You don't need to list every single one or whatever, but
Right.
run us through a little bit of how that's been being a front end, and especially accessibility, specialist, for whatever that means for you. Run us through a little bit how that's been finding work and finding people that care about that sort of thing.
And can I just jump into, if you can just provide some context for what does accessibility mean, and how does that work as part of a job?
Okay. To address what does accessibility mean, I'll address that first, and that is making the web equal and accessible for everybody. It just doesn't have to be a disability. It can be, somebody I'll use this example, in a very rural area who has a 3G phone, and, it's not a very fast connection as to, what we have these days with our shiny new iPhones and stuff like that. And an accessibility, somebody in accessibility would basically not only advocate, but in my daily routine of doing auditing on websites, it's just checking to see if sites are accessible, if they're, if they should be failing web content accessibility guidelines. WCAG is how I pronounce it. There's many different pronunciations to that, but the there's different, I guess, levels of how people will do an audit. Like, you can do, A and double A as far as the levels. So there's A, double A, and triple A. A lot of people I find don't do triple A because it's too stringent, and it's also, you don't have to go that far in most cases. But it's just auditing, making sure sites are accessible, and creating a report for a client, and then telling them, here's what's wrong, here's how you need to fix it. This doesn't, adhere to the guidelines, and recommendations for best practices as well. And, looking at code, and, always looking at HTML and CSS, because CSS too has a strong effect on accessibility. And that's what the job entails. And Dan, what was your question?
Oh, I guess my question was, it's a sort of, I don't know if non-traditional is the right word, but being a specialist really in any regard is a choice, and can limit your options, but like also doing what you want to do, right? And so my question was more like, how has it been on your career journey, being a specialist, especially in the accessibility world?
Right. It's been a challenge lately, in I would say the past 5, maybe 10 years, because not a lot of people, not a lot of companies were looking for accessibility specialists. Not until I've pretty much noticed this year, a lot of companies are now looking for accessibility specialists because companies are getting sued, and they don't want to get sued. That's the bottom line. So my professional journey had been, I did a website for somebody I knew back in New England, Maine. And it was just a small site. And then from there, I got, a few different jobs doing websites. And then from there, I was like, well, if this thing's taken off, I'm going to go the freelance route. So that's what I did. And up until 2015, I was a freelance developer, I guess you could say. I got into WordPress, PHP development, and then I was hired by a company to do their website and their SaaS site, I guess. It was a thing where you log in, and it wasn't a public facing site. And from there, it'd been about, I don't know, I think I counted over 2,000 resumes that I had sent out to companies in 20 years, and one company hired me. And that was that company that I worked for in 2015 to just last year, as a matter of fact. And then finally, somebody took a chance on me. That would have been Nobility. I was hired by Nobility in March or April. Jeez, it's been over 6 months. But
what is time anyway?
Yeah, well, I don't even know anymore. I'm in a different time zone now, so that's messed me up too. But Nobility gave me an opportunity, and very grateful for that opportunity with them. And a lot of great people in Nobility that work for that company. Um, Everybody, as a matter of fact, and they do some really good stuff as far as accessibility goes. And as of October 1st, I will be on the Webstaurant store team as an accessibility engineer. So I look forward to that. Yeah.
Awesome.
Can you talk a little bit about what you'll be doing in that role there? Maybe dive into a little bit of details.
For right now, all I know is it's basically doing the same thing I do now, and that's auditing their product for their website. I know they use React, and I think it was .NET. So that I'll be in that environment.
So, like, when you do an audit, where do you start with that?
So when I do an audit, I do automated checks and scans first. So I use stuff like the Wave extension, the Axe. I now wait until the end to use the Axe Core extension in the browser. Things like there's a command line called Pally, so it's PA11Y. There's that. I use there's bookmarklets from Ian Lloyd and Paul J. Adam that I use to also do checks. Let's see what else. There's Microsoft Accessibility Insights, which is a great tool to use. What else? And I said Axe, color contrast checks. I use the Firefox accessibility dev tools, the accessibility panels and those. And then I move on to manual testing. So mouse only, keyboard only. I will do it, which goes back to color contrast. I'll do the squint test. So I'll just look at the site while I'm squinting at it and see if, I can make out anything, because that I was taught not too long ago. So, and screen readers, I will use screen readers. So for Mac, there's VoiceOver, and it's best to use VoiceOver in Safari because the native, Mac app and everything. NVDA and JAWS on Windows. And and it's very, very rare, but if somebody says, oh, we have Linux users, so I will test on what it's called Orca for Linux. And those are pretty much, if I remember them all correctly, those are the tools I use.
That's awesome. It's very extensive. I was just writing all of them down so that
So was I.
I could
We'll link to those in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. So like day to day, I mean, I know you haven't started yet, but like in your role, will it be mostly doing audits after the fact, or like will you be interfacing with, I'm not sure what they do, what they make or anything like that, but like where in the process are you doing like accessibility, helping the team with this stuff? Like, audits for me imply, and I know this isn't always true, but when I think of it as something, something's done, now we do an audit on it, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering, and I'm sure that's an important part, but I was wondering if there's places earlier in the process where you're able to interface and like, make suggestions before it, as opposed to like fixing things, but like help build something, the
right.
first time.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm sure it's going to be probably a lot of both. Maybe there's existing things on the site that need to be checked. Components that may be being worked on that will have to be checked. I mean, it's that way pretty much with any kind of audit. So I've had companies come to me and say, you know, we've got somebody who emailed us and said this isn't accessible, so we need an audit done. And I'll go through the site and say, okay, I found all this. Here's what you need to do to fix it. They'll fix it. You know, that'll be after the fact, of course. I've had companies come in and ask me to do consulting with their teams before the project starts to make sure that it gets done beforehand. Because when you do an accessibility, when you bring in accessibility from the start of a project, it's so much easier, and there's a lot less stress doing it from the very beginning. Because when you get to the end and you've got everything as accessible as you can, and I'll add that nothing's 100% accessible. It's a lot easier on your teams. You know, like I said, there's a lot less stress. You don't have to go back and, you know, scatter around trying to fix this, that, and the other thing after the fact. So, and that's also where my advocacy comes in, is saying, okay, if you get this done from the start, it's going to be so much easier, and it's going to cost less money because you're not going back. It's going to cause a lot less stress again. And those are the two main things. But to answer the question, it's going to be a little bit of both, I would think, because like I said, it's usually that way at the beginning. You know,
right. Get something to a baseline first.
Yeah. And it's still really early in the process, so I'm not too sure, but I know that it'll be a lot of, you know, checking to make sure everything's good on the end of, you know, before we put this out, we need to make sure it's accessible. So,
yeah.
As you've been working through this industry, do you think, is there one problem that you keep encountering over and over, like standout issues, things that people can just really look at and say, all right, let's start here?
Where do I begin? It's a lot, but mainly it's color contrast. Okay. That's the biggest one. And keyboard accessibility is another. And I'll throw in a third one, and that being alt text on images, the alternative text. I've had, you know, a lot of alt text can be a tricky thing, because people think, well, I have this image and I need to really go into detail what that image is conveying if it's an informative image, and you really don't. Just a short, you know, it's a purple flower in a field, is fine. You don't have to go into, I've seen on Twitter, because they give you 1,000 characters for alt text, and I've seen alt text that long before.
I always wonder, like, I don't think I've written enough, because I'm not even close to the 1,000, and I have 1,000 to write.
Yeah, I always try to just like just say the joke, or I mean, usually if I'm posting an image, it's a joke, you know, but like
right.
Whatever the shortest version of the joke is, you know. Yeah. So I like posted one today, and it was just like guy saying thumbs up or something like that, you know. You know what I mean? Yeah. And like that seems, to me, that at least seems like usually enough. I don't need to give them all.
Sometimes I just don't post because I don't know how to describe it. I'm like, well, I'm not really sure that I know how to say and capture what this is doing. So we'll go for something else.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate around how long should it be. Should it be 180 characters? Should it be a certain amount of words? But just as long as it conveys in a short, succinct sentence, I guess, that's fine. And of course, you have some images, decorative, that, you know, it needs an empty alt text. And that's a big one, because I was just doing an audit and they had decorative images, but no empty alt text, which is just the alt equals quotes, and the quotes are empty in between.
Can you explain that? Because I had just recently learned about that, but still don't quite understand why that's the standard.
So it tells the screen reader there's an image there, but it doesn't need, it's decorative basically. So it just, there's no need to
So
describe.
what happens in a screen reader if it runs into an image with no alt attribute at all?
It skips over it, so the user is losing information. So if there's something you're trying to convey, like let's use the like an infographic for example, and there's no alt text on it, that user that's using the screen reader is not gonna know that it's there.
Totally. And so in the case of a decorative image where we don't need to like, it's okay if a screen, if it's okay if anybody skips over it. What is the tactical difference for a screen reader, for a user on a screen reader, between an image with with a alt property and just an empty string, and an image with no alt, defined at all?
So if it's okay, let's use a logo as an example. If you have empty alt text on your logo, and it's also linked, the screen reader will read that link, and you don't want that to read it. You want it to, it doesn't really need to. I mean, there's cases where somebody may say, yeah, I want the person to know what the logo looks like, but it's not really necessary. No alt text, it's, the screen reader won't read anything. And as far as I know, and I'll be the first to say, I'm not an expert by any means with screen readers, because there's a lot of different stuff I've been learning lately. But to my recollection, anyways, an empty. So no alt text. Let me get this straight. No alt text. The URL will be read to the image.
Okay, yeah, that's the big difference. All right, that's the part I didn't know.
Yes.
Right. So if there's no alt text at all, like no alt property defined, when a screen reader is reading it, it'll come through normal text, and then it'll just read like blah blah blah.jpg.
Yes.
Right. Okay,
yes.
That's it.
And then
nice.
the empty alt is silent, so
and that means that tells it to skip right over it, which is what you want sometimes. Like sometimes that is the preferred thing, or like the decorative image where it's just a background image or something like that, or maybe not background, but like something that's just used for decoration, doesn't need to convey actually information.
Right.
And so in those cases, putting an empty alt equals empty string is actually very good, and much like very good for accessibility, because otherwise they're going to see probably a very long URL with .jpg, which means nothing to them, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's one of those things that it's like, and I've seen a lot of people. Well, this is a separate topic, but like that little like that little bit, the just even just alt, and getting like your head wrapped around how to deal with alt text. Like you said, can make a huge difference for accessibility, make a huge difference for your users.
Yep.
Oh, that's really cool.
You were talking about one of the big problems being color contrast, and that seems like something that could be pretty simple to identify with a lighthouse audit. Can you explain what a lighthouse audit is? And if you're like, that's not the way to go, this other method is better, I would love to hear that as well.
So, I mean, I've used Lighthouse before. I don't really rely on Lighthouse. Lighthouse runs off of Axe Core, and which is great, but I don't think it really gets to the root of every issue, and it really can't. Plus, you have false positives, which is something. For example, I was just talking about this on the in the Slack, virtual coffee Slack. False positives for color contrast. I've come across instances where it will flag color contrast errors, but the color contrast is far exceeds the 4.5 to 1 ratio. So I don't really rely on Lighthouse. I mean, it's a good tool, don't get me wrong, because there's that performance piece to it that I really, really like using. And as far as, you know, it's a good tool, don't get me wrong, but I use, and I used to use it. I used to use it myself. I mean, I used it on my site and was like, yeah, 100s. I got 100s across the board, and that virtual confetti flying everywhere. But the tools that I use would be it's contrast ratio.com, which is Leah Verou's color contrast site. I also use let me look on, I have it on my other machine here, the color contrast analyzer, and that is by the Paciella group. So Stephen Faulkner has based on the Windows version. The Mac OS version was developed by somebody else. I use that tool as well, and I will provide the link to that.
This is great. I'm like really looking forward to diving into a lot of these resources that you are dropping right now, because I think sometimes it's hard to know where to start, and I think that's just a problem with teaching developers in general. There's not a focus on it. It's not built into most curriculums and at all. And so there's a lack of focus, I think, as a result of that. And then not knowing where to start, or if you're with a company that doesn't look at those things, then I think you can find yourself a while down the path and not know what you should be identifying, how you should be approaching this. And so the more that we talk about it, I think the better. Where do you think people could get started if they want to learn more about accessibility?
So the W3C has a great intro to accessibility class, which I believe is still free. And it's an introduction to web accessibility on edX.org. And I took that class even. And it's great. You can pace yourself. Doesn't have to be real fast. There's no due date or anything. There's a free version. If you want the certificate, you got to pay a certain amount. It's like if you put in 4 to 5 hours a week, it's like four weeks long to do. Gives a good overview of accessibility and some of the guidelines. There's a lot of good information on the web, and I even have to pitch Nobility's website and their blog. They go over some of the WCAG guidelines, and accessibility is also, I want to make this clear, accessibility is more than just WCAG guidelines. It's also about inclusive design as well, making sure certain demographics aren't kept out, that everybody's included, hence the name inclusive design. But some other let's see, that's a good question, because there's so much. I mean, I guess a search would come up with a lot of different things. WebAIM.org has some good stuff as far as accessibility, learning accessibility. Level Access does. Let's see who else. TPGI has good stuff. So there's a lot out there that people can find on Even there's even like courses on, I guess, Udemy and platforms like that as well.
So this has kind of been your focus the entire time you've been working in tech. Was there a reason that you went down this path, or something that kind of inspired this journey, or have you just always been interested in it?
Uh, it started when a couple family members, I have like 3 family members that have disabilities. Two have motor skill disabilities, one visual. And seeing the looks of frustration on their faces when they're trying to access something that's inaccessible on the web really got me motivated in the beginning and carries me to this day, really. Um, I kind of, towards like 2018, 2019, was kind of like, I guess, slacking off a little bit with my accessibility, but I got together with our friend Chris DeMars in Burlington, Vermont. There was a conference, and he gave a great talk, and that really lit the fire again. So there's been it's been like laser like focus for me as far as since then. And just the looks of frustration on faces of people that I've seen trying to access something that's inaccessible on the web. Um, it's just, it's very, um, the word I'm looking for here, very, it hits home. It really, being that I try to advocate for people that don't have a voice. And I think as accessibility professionals, we all do. We try to advocate for those people, especially lately with certain, I will use it in quotes, accessibility overlays, for instance. But yeah, that's basically where it all started, was just those family members and friends, and just seeing people, you know, the frustration and the point where they're ready to give up.
Yeah, I was just with Chris last week. He spoke at KCDC. He, along with Cass Ferris, and they did an accessibility talk. That was the first time I got to see him speak in person. It was really great because they both come at it with a lot of passion and examples. And I think for so many of us, we have a general sense of what accessibility is, but we don't have that broader sense of, it might be, there might be a disability that you can't see, or it might be a temporary disability or a mental health challenge that somebody is going through. And all
Mhm.
of those things can impact what accessibility looks like. And if you really look at the people around you, you for sure know someone that has one of those challenges, or you have one yourself. And so, opening up the conversations about this, like you have, and like Chris and Cass have, I think is so important to really making change in tech overall.
Yeah, you brought up invisible, disabilities. I have migraine headaches. I get them when something sets off. If there's a website I visit that has, animation or motion that really, it's too much and it triggers a migraine. I mean, there's all that stuff that you mentioned, and it's, you know, uh, Chris is great. Yeah, I've seen him talk, virtually, and then before the pandemic and everything, and we've gotten to know each other, and he does a great job advocating.
Yeah, I think, even so, a couple years ago, I was diagnosed with ADHD, and it's interesting how much I didn't realize that impacts the things that I interact with and the
Mhm.
ways that I interact with things. And I feel like maybe this is just a personal problem, but this is the conversation between Discord and Slack for me. Like I walk into Discord, I don't walk in there. I open up Discord and it's immediately just overwhelming and I don't
Mhm.
know where to go from there. And then I just like slowly back out the door, right? Like there's too
Yeah.
much going on for me.
Yeah, that information overload happens to me as well. It's like Slack and uh, Discord, and there's yeah. I was watching a Twitch stream yesterday, and the chat was going off, and I was just like, I can't. I want to be able to kind of read the chat, and I can't because yeah, the information overload is a big thing too. Yeah.
So I think your background, you talked about your journey through this, and it seems like you've been mostly self-taught then. Is that right?
Yeah, I started when I picked up that Commodore 64 user manual, and just I loved to read, and I read that. I had purchased a book. It was Learn HTML in 21 Days, and it was like a big, huge, thick phone book like manual. I read through that. That's how I actually made my first website. Not that I put it out on the web or anything, but then um, I graduated from there on. I went to GeoCities and Angel Fire and Tripod and all those websites, if you remember those websites,
Oh, yeah.
and all the great, lime green and pastel and, fluorescent colors. Um, and then, it's been a learning process the entire time. And I love to learn. So it's one of those things where if I can pick up something in a Slack group or on a Discord channel, that's great. I keep learning every day, and, learning lately it's been learning the intricacies of the WCAG guidelines because there's so much there. And being able to, and I'm grateful for this, being able to work on the next, I guess, version, which is 3.0, which is a few years down the road, has been a learning process as well. And being a member of the W3C is too, and being in those meetings and learning so much from a great group of people.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that idea of just consistent learning and being open to learning all of the time because I think no matter what part of tech or any industry really that you're in, that being open to learning new things and talking through things with other people and understanding is, that's what growing is about. That's what is important to what you're doing.
Yeah, and it's even I've I learn on Twitter as well. I see
Yeah.
something, a link to an article or something, and I check it out, and it's like, oh well, you know, it, today I learned, and
Yeah.
I it's there was a quote, and I'll try to find that quote because I love the quote. It had something to do with doing something. Yeah, right there. Um, there are three things everyone should do every day. Number one is laugh. Number two is think. Spend some time in thought. Number three, you should have your emotions move you to tears. If you laugh, think, and cry, that's a heck of a day. And that was just like the best quote I think I've seen in a long, long time. I even add to that learning one thing a day.
Yeah, I love that so much.
Yeah.
I even think, learning things on Twitter for me has been really big as well. Even when somebody just has a small portion of a tweet, for some reason it sticks in my mind better than if I read a whole article on that thing. And I think
Yeah.
maybe because there's some type of personal connection there, like oh, I remember that person said this one thing, and it might be some type of coding tip or whatever. But
Yeah.
I think that just sharing that knowledge, or it's, hey, I know that I could ask that person that question, can be really helpful in finding the answers to things, or having more confidence in being able to ask questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I use Twitter as a tool to say, oh, you mentioned something about the new, um, whatever coming down the line. I've got a couple questions for you. Hey, can I, DM you? I got a question I need to ask. And reaching out to somebody to the person that, had that tweet is, I don't think I've ever had anybody go, no, I don't want to tell you the answer or anything like that. So, yeah, it's always been, hey, I've got this question. People are more than welcome to answer those questions.
Yeah, and I think that's so big, especially when we're talking about this topic. If you don't
Yeah.
know, it is okay to ask somebody, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or ask someone just to direct you. I'm getting
Yep.
started in this. It's not been a focus. How do I get started? What do I do? And you've
Mm-hmm.
dropped a lot of great resources here, but I think in every place and space we should know that it is okay to ask about these things, and it's good to do that.
Yeah, definitely. I tell people, if you have a question about accessibility, I'll do my best to answer it. If I can't answer it, I will find somebody that can, or I will look it up and see if I can get you the answer. Because it's that little, it's that being helpful
Mhm.
in making sure that person has that information. For me, anyways, is big. And just saying, feeling good about being able to help people.
Yeah, for sure. That's so important.
I love that.
Todd, we have about a time for one more question, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, because I know that there still are companies out there that are have some pushback about paying for making things accessible, or they say, like, well, that's not our focus right now because we don't have the time or the money to do that. How would
Mm-hmm.
you approach that situation? Or maybe if you were a developer consulting on that, how would you kind of convince them that this should be a priority?
Funny you mentioned that because I wrote a article about that, and it's on Smashing Magazine. So I'll get that link to you as well. It's a very tricky slope. Sometimes, I've heard people, for instance, say, "Well, you don't want to get sued," and that kind of perks up stakeholders' ears and says, "Oh, well, I guess we're going to have to do this." I use real world examples of, for instance, I ran into a stakeholder on a project, and I said, we've got to make sure accessibility is done from the very beginning of the project. He turned to me and said, we don't have disabled users. I, in turn, said to him, you're wearing eyeglasses. That's an assistive technology. And he kind of perked up, but I hadn't convinced him. So there's some people that can be very stubborn. So I went as far as to say, somebody working, using your product, they could have a broken arm. It could be a situational disability. They could have a broken arm. They could be at home working with a child on their lap that's very fussy. I've been there a long time ago. I know that feeling. And I know, Becca, you're a parent. I don't know if you're a parent, Dan, but
Oh yeah.
yeah. So you both know that, you have a child on your lap and they're fussy, and you're trying to answer an email or something. It's very difficult. So, getting teams on board is another thing too,
Mhm.
where getting a person dedicated to doing accessibility on the design side, on the development side, on the marketing side, that helps too. But the main thing is getting stakeholders on board. If you can get a stakeholder on board, then it should be much, much easier to get the entire organization on board.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. It all comes down to listening and being open-minded, right? If we work towards understanding each other, then we can all do a whole lot more to improve things for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. Yep. And I've heard it. I've heard it before. We don't have the budget. We'll get to it after launch. Well, it brings me back to you. If you do everything from the beginning, you will have the money for it, and it'll be less stress. So
yeah. And you don't need to find the budget to pay for a whole round of auditing and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. Right. And auditing. So I'll use an example of a company that got sued, and what they could have spent just with, doing it from the beginning, they ended up paying 7 figures for an audit. So that should tell you something about that process.
Right. And it should never have to come to that. That's just, absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
But I'm so glad that you were here today to talk us through this and drop all of these great resources. And I really hope that, it helps people who are listening to work through this stuff and to know that it's okay to ask questions and to grow and learn more all the time. So we'll make sure that we drop all of those links in the show notes. And thanks so much for being here with us today, Todd.
Yeah, thanks, Todd.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it too.
Yeah, thank you both for having me.
Bye.
All right, bye, Todd.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Virtual Coffee Podcast. This episode was produced by Dan Ott and Becca Harrott-Weigel and was edited by Andy Bonjour at Good Day Communications. If you have questions or comments, you can hit us up on Twitter at virtualcoffee.io or email us at podcast@virtualcoffee.io. You can find the show notes, sign up for our newsletter, check out any of our other resources on our website at virtualcoffee.io. And of course, join us for our virtual coffee chats every Tuesday at 9 a.m. Eastern and Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. Please subscribe to our podcast and be sure to leave us a review. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.